Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, we welcome you to the second day of the 13th International Conference on Cyber Conflict.
We're happy to welcome you back and also extend a warm welcome to those of you who have just joined us today. I'm Henrik Beckvart.
And I am Liina Lumiste.
And we are your hosts for this conference. And on behalf of the organizing team at the NATO CCDCOE, we're excited to have you with us here online from Tallinn.
Today, we will start off with two keynotes. One from NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, David van Weel, and the other from Chief Information Security Officer at Fortinet, Philip Quaid. As yesterday, please share your thoughts and ideas also on social media by using the hashtag CyCon 2021.
Hard to think that NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, Mr. David van Weel, needs much introduction. So without further ado, please, Mr. van Weel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henrik, and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure joining you today, and I'm very happy to be able to continue the legacy of representing NATO Cyber at this prestigious event. My thanks go to the Center of Excellence, as ever, for organizing this event and for their diligence in keeping this important platform going over all these years. 2021 is a watershed year for cyber, and in more ways than one. First, we witness a growing diversity of risks and incidents. Second, we can observe a growing diversity in the strategic context of cyber. And third, as a consequence, we are seeing a growing diversity of NATO's responses to cyber challenges. Let me address each of these developments in turn. First, the risks and incidents. Here we can observe that threat actors are consistently broadening the range of tools for challenging the alliance in cyberspace. I offer three examples. One example is ransomware. Ransomware used to be associated with seeking economic benefits, and it was never seen as a major political factor. However, ransomware attacks have now become so severe that the UK NCSC and others have started to issue regular warnings about this form of threat. The attack by the DarkSide group against Colonial Pipeline in the US was a very recent reminder of the growing significance of ransomware attacks. And since Colonial Pipeline supplied almost half of the fuel for the US East Coast, the attacks disrupted that supply and led to a considerable increase in gas prices. As a result, airlines had to reschedule their flights to bunker, and the Biden administration relaxed some regulatory conditions regarding the quality of petrol to ensure continuity of supply to the pumps. What is interesting from our perspective is the statement put out by DarkSide Ransomware Group, the group that was designated by the US as being responsible. Perhaps fearing some kind of retaliation or consequences, they issued a statement saying that they were only in it for the money and not politically motivated. Whether this is any consolation, I leave for you to judge. Another example of the broadening of the toolbox of hybrid aggressors is influence operations. These too are on the rise, and we witness more and more cases of information being corrupted or modified in order to influence populations or decision makers, often with the help of social media. One recent example was the targeting of Polish government websites and official social media accounts. The aim of attackers was to spread false information, most likely in order to stir up unrest about plans for Poland's nuclear power program. Finally, we see an uptick in cyber-enabled espionage, as exemplified by the SolarWinds case at the turn of the year. That case was interesting because it compromised a company which represented a highly lucrative target as a jumping-off point for the perpetrators to then access a wealth of downstream users. Some likened this attack to a kind of cyber intelligence preparation of the battlefield. There's a saying that one should never let a good crisis go to waste, and that's why we need to ask ourselves the question whether these incidents are leading us to adapt our defenses accordingly. In fact, we are seeing this play out in real time as the Biden administration and US Congress are determined to rapidly review the lessons of SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline. Clearly, the US is regarding these attacks as a wake-up call. It should be for all of us. We need to be even more vigilant than before. The second major change is the growing dynamism of the strategic contexts in which these threats occur. Many nations are becoming more muscular and overt about their approaches and tolerance to cyber risks. There's also a growing perception that cyber deterrence may not be the best way to look at the issue. For example, the 2018 US Cyber Defense Strategy tones down the deterrence notion and instead uses terminology like persistent engagement. For a long time, the dominant narrative was that cyberspace should be treated just like any other domains, like air, land, and sea. Not anymore. The pendulum is beginning to swing. Cyberspace is unique, and hence we need to find a better conceptualization. Using insufficient analogies from nuclear deterrence theory or special operations will not help decision makers. Rather, it will mislead them. The notion of cyber deterrence may sound reassuring, yet the more we learn about cyberspace, the less compelling it appears to draw parallels between the cyber and nuclear domains. And in a similar vein, we need to revisit the notion of thresholds. A good example is cyber attribution. For quite some time, we have put our hopes in the belief that aggressors don't want to be called out. Hence, the mere risk of being named and shamed would deter them from committing certain malign actions. It doesn't appear so. We see an increasing number of statements which call out unacceptable behavior in cyberspace. Yet this drawing of new red lines doesn't seem to have much of a deterrent effect. On the contrary, we see old thresholds being crossed. Now, the good news is that many stricken nations seem increasingly willing to strike back with a set of tools that's broader than merely attribution. But the fact of the matter is that the goalposts are moving. The Rubicon that you just wouldn't cross is no more. Clearly, the role of cyber on the geopolitical stage continues to grow. One indication is the discussion on supply chain risk, be it through SolarWinds late last year or the ongoing discussion about trust and third-party vendors that surfaced during the debate over the transition to 5G. We also see the private sector flexing its muscles, acting in some respects with quasi-state-like power. Is social media companies silencing elected officials a good thing? Is it ethical? Is it even a role of the private company to deplatform somebody? Finally, there's also an increasing recognition of the nature of the persistent struggle between offense and defense. Simply put, the assumption that in cyberspace the defense is always one step behind might not hold forever. Shifting to a proactive approach, as some allies have done, may be indication of this change. In any case, there's no law of nature that would condemn the defensive to always lose out. My third and final point is the need to have a broad range of responses. Just as the threat landscape is diversifying, so must our cyber toolbox. As many of you will be aware, allies are presently in the midst of negotiating a new NATO cyber defense policy, due to be agreed later this summer. It represents a major update of our previous policy, which was agreed in 2014 at the Wales Summit. The 2014 policy was in itself quite significant. It brought cyber defense under the umbrella of collective defense, the famous Article 5, and it affirmed the applicability of international humanitarian law to cyberspace. Since then, we've consistently broadened our cyber toolbox. In 2016, at the Watershed Summit, allies committed to the Cyber Defense Pledge to strengthen the cyber defenses of national infrastructures and networks, and to do so as a matter of priority. Allies also agreed to recognize cyberspace as a domain of operations, just as air, land, and sea. Associated with this, we also adopted the NATO command structure to bring online a new Cyberspace Operations Center, the CyOC, and we created a unique platform, the so-called SCEPFA, the mouthful of sovereign cyber effects provided voluntarily by allies, which allows allies to volunteer their national offensive cyber capabilities into alliance operations and missions. Looking at the question of critical infrastructure, so-called NATO's baseline requirements for national resilience, were updated in 2019 and 2020 to take into account the challenge from 5G, foreign direct investments, and the implications of the COVID pandemic. These non-binding guidelines represent the canon of good practice for allies to help them build national resilience, because we understand that NATO's collective performance as a defense alliance ultimately depends upon the national resilience of each ally. A similar logic applies to NATO's dependence on national supply chains. NATO's own infrastructure is relatively small, which makes it crucially important for us to review our own measures for addressing supply chain risks. This is particularly true for those technologies that underpin NATO's own ICT footprint and our operations and missions. Finally, let me return to the bigger picture. In 2019, allies agreed a NATO guide for strategic response options to malicious cyber activities. This guide, or toolbox, sets out a range of measures that allies and NATO can take to respond to cyber threats below the threshold of an armed attack. Amongst the elements, it lists diplomatic or political statements, economic sanctions that allies may wish to agree and implement within their sovereign right, the expulsion of officials, the sharing of information, and of course, attribution. The guide reinforces the importance of NATO as an important venue for exchange of information and as a means to signal unity and solidarity, for example, in the case of collective attribution. In sum, our cyber toolbox is broadening in line with the diversifying threat landscape, and we must do everything to maintain the momentum in our cyber agenda. So what's next? A few pointers. First, the upcoming summit will place an understandable emphasis upon resilience as part of the NATO 2030 agenda. As has become obvious during the pandemic, there is something of a perfect storm approaching with regards to cyber supply chain issues. Our societies are more and more reliant upon resilient infrastructures, frequently underpinned by cyber technologies. But these infrastructures are subject to risk stemming from a complex economic and industrial landscape. These risks force us to adopt and to implement more sophisticated approaches to resilience. In keeping our societies safe and secure, there are no easy fixes. Second, we need to better align strategy with the strategic environment. Given the diversifying threat landscape I described earlier, this should be a no-brainer. Yet all too often I find that there is too little thought given to this. In particular, we will need to fully acknowledge that the real security implications of the exploitation of cyberspace do not come from a single big bang, but through the accumulating effect of risk salami slicing away at our defense. In other words, those who want to harm us can achieve the same strategic gains below the threshold of a response. And this means that allies will need to be ready and comfortable with using all the tools in the toolbox to manage escalation risk. Clearly, rolling with the punches seems to no longer be an effective way of dealing with aggression in cyberspace. Third, we must make an even greater effort to use NATO as a unifying platform. This pertains in particular to the discussion on tech standards, where innovation has implications for cyber. The current debate on artificial intelligence is such a case, but NATO's unifying role can also be extended to the ongoing debate on cyber norms and the application of international humanitarian law. In all of these areas, we should use NATO to help us devise a collective response to our challenges in the international system. We must not allow those revisionist powers to destroy this system. Then finally, in responding to new security challenges, we are also rapidly progressing on our work on emerging and disruptive technologies. Our artificial intelligence strategy will be published shortly, and we are also working on a policy to help NATO make the most of the vast volumes of data. While data and AI are inextricably linked, cyber defense is no doubt going to be one of the key areas in which they will apply. Ladies and gentlemen, let me close by noting that cyberspace doesn't stand still. And similarly, if we are to keep our promise of protecting our populations, neither can NATO. We have to be able to adapt to the changing trends of disruption and exploitation of cyberspace, to the changing thinking and conceptualization of responses, and to our evolved understanding of the tasks and priorities for NATO in defending cyberspace. Looking at the evolution of NATO's cyber defense policy and toolbox, I can confidently say that this adaptation will succeed. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a great conference.